Hello and welcome to lucky episode 101 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Babones, and joining me today is Yun Jiang, the inaugural China Matters Fellow at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. In just a little over 2 weeks, Yun will be a featured speaker at the Center for Independent Studies' flagship Concilium Conclave in the Hunter Valley. Today, we'll be asking her about nationalism and despondency among young people in today's China. Yun Jiang, how are you?
I am doing very well. I'm currently in Canberra.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Hopefully, we can change that for the better.
I like Canberra. And interestingly, I'm actually also from the Hunter Valley. I grew up in the Hunter Valley, so I'm looking forward to the Concilium.
It'll be fantastic. You'll have to show us around. Look, here in Sydney, and throughout the West, we've heard a lot about rising nationalism among young people in China, wolf warriors and people being very aggressive. But how much is that picture true?
It is true that the youth of today is much more nationalistic compared to people from, say, 1 or 2 generations ago. Right. But I think there's a reason for that. Now, firstly, of course, that's due to partly the propaganda and patriotic education from the Chinese Communist Party. So since the 1990s, the government of China, which is a Chinese Communist Party, has started patriotic education through its schools. So all the young people that has gone through the schooling system has received that. Basically, they talk about love of the country and love of the party, conflating the two together as well. So that's definitely one big reason. But another reason is the fact that China has, objectively speaking, became stronger as well. Okay. So in the past, say in the 1960s, China was a closed country. So that was during the Mao period. And the population was actually misled into believing that China was a prosperous and powerful country. So when China as a country opened up under that generation of people was really disenfranchised. They realized what the real information is, what the real facts from the outside, that China was actually weak and poor. So that has the people from a generation have developed some sort of inferiority complex, believing that foreign is always better. Now, people of this generation, China has truly become richer and more powerful. So for them, they do believe that they feel more proud of China's achievements naturally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was, listening to you speak there, it struck me something very obvious that I never thought of until you said it, was that patriotic education in China inculcates both a love of country, but also a love of party. And of course, I didn't think that because outside China, that's just not the way we do education. I mean, we've heard a lot about nationalism in China. Has there been as much success of the Chinese government in inculcating a love of party in China?
I think it is quite successful for people to link the country with a party. But that does not necessarily mean that youth of today or people in China in general are always supportive of government policies or what the party is doing. So especially when there's a critique from the outside of China's government policies, the party often says, well, they're criticizing the country, the people. So there is this conflation there. But we think domestically, the Chinese people are still often criticizing government policies, especially on the implementation side as well.
Right. Now, we are a live show. We do take comments and questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience, you'd like to get your question into Yun Jiang, please send it through. Anthony Carr has mentioned on YouTube, a regular viewer, people are always attracted by and want to be associated with success. And Anthony, that's why we're attracted by and want to be associated with you and with all of our other viewers. But let me turn that into a question, Yun. To what extent is rising Chinese nationalism really not due to school education and party programs and propaganda? Is it just what you said at the beginning, a natural reaction to China's rising place in the world?
I think the two factors are both important. Um, if there was no patriotic education, China, the people in China would likely to still be more proud of the achievements of the country than they have been previously when it was weak, when it was under what they called bullying by other imperial powers during the Qing dynasty. So that is definitely a factor. But I think patriotic education still plays an important role in really emphasizing and underscoring that, and to keep that into people's mind more often.
Right. Now, there are endless debates about, nationalism versus patriotism. Is nationalism bad? Is patriotism good? I don't want to try to pin you down on these definitions, because this goes on forever. But is it possible that some form of national pride, whatever you want to call it, can actually be a positive force for reform? And can in China, could that potentially be reflected in people holding their government accountable to fulfilling the aspirations that they've raised?
I think nationalism can be a force for good. In the past, in Chinese history, there has been periods of different political movements that's based on nationalism. So we
Right.
have the May 4th movement and self-strengthening movement. They're basically about people wanting the country to be stronger. And as part of that, what they did was learning from the West. So especially in science and technology, that has had an effect of making the country, making some reforms in the country. So nationalism is definitely a way to improve the country as well, so to a positive side. On the other hand, one thing that the current government is also concerned about is that the nationalist sentiment may push the government towards more of a hawkish stance. So especially on issues such as the mainland's relationship with Taiwan, there's a lot of talks about ultra hawkish nationalists online, basically saying, well, it's the time to demonstrate that we are actually powerful. Let's retake Taiwan. And that's not something the Chinese government actually want or encourage.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the May 4th movement. If I'm remembering right, May 4th is a National Youth Day in China. Is that correct? And it is
Yes.
because the youth were involved in the overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the implementation of the modern Chinese republic in, correct me, is this 19...
I think so. It's slightly more than 100 years now.
Okay,
I
a little
remember
of that, yeah, in the
centenary.
1910s. Would you see reform in China today as coming in the same way, up from youth, as opposed to, from reformers within the party hierarchy?
Well, youth are always more radical, I guess, than the older generations. That's not just in China, but in a lot of countries. University students are always the first to go to protest and hold, at that time, radical views. But the problem is, in almost all countries, the youth don't hold the power. They like to they tend to come from the outside, the power holders, and push for reform. But in China, as we know, because it's an authoritarian system, so forces from outside the system, outside the party, is much weaker. So they have less influence on policies than perhaps in other countries.
All right. One of our viewers, Tony, was at a seminar last night at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Maybe you saw him there. I couldn't be there because actually at the Center for Independent Studies, we were hosting Lord Jonathan Sumption, the eminent British jurist and historian. So too many good events happening in Sydney all at the same time. But Tony was at the Bates-Gill seminar, and he said that Bates-Gill stressed the primacy of the party in everything Xi Jinping is doing. The party, not the state. Now, I'm really curious to know your view on this, because I myself have gone on record as saying, no, actually, it seems to me that she is obviously Communist parties everywhere in China, but it seems to me that she is working through state institutions, not so much through party institutions. What's your own view on this?
I think under Xi Jinping, he has really stressed the importance of party building. And I think party has gained much more prominence as an institution than state compared to the previous leaders. Now, she is, that he has encouraged a kind of a personality cult as well, and centralization of power to himself.
Right.
But what he's trying to do, and he has a lot of comparisons between he and Mao Zedong as well. But what the difference is that Mao, during the Cultural Revolution, was outside the party. It was trying to basically destroy the party from the outside and rebuilding in his image. He was a revolutionary, whereas she is very much establishment power, establishment leader. So he is about building the institution of the party. But you're also right. At the same time, he's talking a lot about building more institutions and the rule of law, although some people say that's more like rule by law. So he's also building state power at the same time.
All right. You raised the issue of the Cultural Revolution, which was, of course, not only a Maoist movement, but very much a youth-focused movement in roughly 1968 to 73. We can be malleable about the dates. I'm wondering, would the Cultural Revolution have happened if video games had existed in the late 1960s and early 1970s in China? And you know why I'm asking you that question.
Who knows? Who knows what would happen if video games existed?
Well, but obviously, look, I'm being facetious, but China about a year ago put very heavy restrictions on video games and heavy restrictions on youth access to online video games. Now, video games are, maybe a way to keep rebellious youth quiet, let them play their games, let them shoot things up in a virtual reality. So I am kind of suggesting, well, first of all, I'd love to know what's behind China's crackdown on video games, which has been really, so extreme that many people in the Western world want to copy it and want to have
that's right. Well, the Chinese Communist Party has always had a very paternalistic strand to its governance. It really believes that the government knows what's best. So, in a lot of other countries, perhaps you think, well, it's the role of the parents to stop their children from playing video games. But in a paternalistic frame set, the government has a role to tell the parents and to tell the children what's best for them. And the Chinese government believes that children are spending too much time playing video games. They're not spending enough time, perhaps studying or doing sports. So there's another thing about encouraging masculinity among Chinese boys as well. So sporting is now becoming more prominent. But they think that video games are a vice. That's almost like drugs and alcohol in some other people's mind, that they should be restricted.
Right. So first of all, thanks to Tony for passing through the date 1919, of course, for the May 4th movement being a reaction to the Treaty of Versailles and the anti-China provisions in the Treaty of Versailles. But I want to I know it may sound ridiculous, but I am curious about these restrictions on video games and Chinese youth discontent in China. I mean, we could view video games as a bread and circuses, as a soporific for young people who've been stuck at home through coronavirus lockdowns. I mean, is it possible that this might backfire on Xi Jinping? Like, instead of having all the angry young people playing video games and chatting online, he may have them in the streets instead.
Look, I think that's unlikely. There are a lot of things the state has within its power to stop the people to congregate and to protest. In a way, I mean, there are still protests happening in a smaller scale, but in a way that will, topple the government or threaten the government. So I think that's unlikely. But yeah, I think it's more about, from paternalistic side, to really guiding. The party likes to see itself almost like in a paternal role as a father of the country. It's guiding. Right. It's the children towards a proper and right. better behavior.
It's funny you should use that word, the paternalism and father of the country, because again, Tony put in the comments the comment that this tension between legalism and Confucianism, which goes back 2,000 years in Chinese history, we could maybe apply that to today's Communist Party. I mean, how would you apply that tension to the Communist Party today?
I think, despite throughout the history, the public messaging has always been that the leadership and the emperors are Confucian. Legalism has always been quite at the center of a lot of dynasties, basically. And right. under a current regime, under the current communist government, legalism is again heavily used. You can see how, punishment to fit the crime is very much emphasized. It's not, even though the public messaging again is very Confucianism, it's very much about morals. We need to guide people through morals, but the way they actually encourage what they think is proper and good behavior is still through legalism.
Okay. Now, under a totalitarian regime like today's China, protest is very difficult, but there is an odd form of protest that's been making the news, at least here in the West. And I'm curious how prominent it is in China. We've heard about the quote unquote lying flat movement. Can you explain to us what the lying flat movement is? Is that an appropriate translation of the Chinese term? And how big is it?
Yeah, it's a literal translation of Tangping. It's a lying flat movement. It's quite popular online. I think, in my mind, it's a little bit like the Great Resignation in Australia and the United States in the West. Basically, it's about people who realize that they're always in the rat race. Basically, you're always in the rat race. No matter what you do, you always need to do more. Nothing's ever enough. So then they want to just be more of a Zen Buddhism-like, to take a break, to lie down, as they say, to lie flat, right. To not strive and to be constantly striving for something. I think it came from a culture that in China, there's a hyper competition in China. Everything from even when you start at kindergarten, you are being often forced to take a lot of classes, to learn different languages, all the way through to universities. And once you graduate, the competition for jobs is again very intense. So it's constant competition, and including looking for spouses as well. And that has led to people just wanting to quit the rat race.
Right. About this time last year, I remember China essentially abolished its entire after-school education industry in one fell swoop. Now, that does illustrate the challenges of doing business in a country like China, but also, was that a response? I mean, was that a response to the pressures that are being put on children in China? Or was it, I mean, I could see it as a response to eliminate any alternate bases of education outside the state. That is, you can only learn what you learn in a state school. I mean, how should we understand that really dramatic move last year?
It's definitely the former. It's definitely about they're trying to reduce the pressure on students, because even with those after-school tutoring, they're still teaching the same curriculum as the ones in school. So they're not teaching them how to think critically or things like that anyway.
But it wasn't just English language schools or things like it was all after-school schooling.
Yep.
Even math and science, all of it.
So what the government's what the government was trying to do is to reduce pressure so that the students, they just go to schools, do their homework, and then they don't have to go to after school tutoring. But the problem is that it has not removed incentive for competition. Because what they did is, even though they have said, okay, you can't do after school tutoring, the competition for university places are still just as intense. This means what happened was the middle class children or poor people, they can't afford to take their children to tutoring, but the richer people can still go to individual tutoring. So it actually increased the social divide.
Well, but I hear that both ways, because other people would say that under the with after-school tutoring, it was the middle class and the rich who could afford the tutoring, and the poor who could. So, like, should I understand this? I mean, are you confident that this reform will? I mean, I know it will benefit the ultra-rich, perhaps, but will it be benefiting the rich at the expense of the middle class, as opposed to middle class at the expense of the poor?
Sorry. So yes, definitely, it's more about the middle class. So people who go to after-school tutoring are mostly the middle class, whereas the richer people, they can afford individual tutoring. And I guess if you're on the lowest stratum of society, then you can't afford any tutoring to begin with.
What's funny about the history of education in the West, and particularly in England, is that the public school, quote unquote, arose as a venue for the middle class, right? Because the aristocracy had private tutoring. But those middle class schools became so prestigious because they were so much better than the aristocratic tutoring, that the aristocrats then wanted their children in the public schools, right? So they became exclusive venues. But has the same, I mean, are we now seeing the same sort of logic play out with China, that these private schools, the after-school tutoring, were they actually better than the education that was available elsewhere? And is that why they're being disbanded? I mean, I'm really struggling to understand. Well, forgive me. Frankly, I'm very suspicious of the motive. Well, the party just cared so much about young people. It didn't want so. Where do you see as the motive here? I mean, I know you've talked around this a bit, but do you have a clear view of why
they do care about young people? Because what the pressure on having on these children mean is that people are not wanting to have children. One of the problems with, as I'm sure you know, the Chinese Communist Party is very much concerned that declining birth rates, the changing demographics, and one of the big reasons for young couples not wanting to have children, one is that the former one-child policy has meant the people are just used to having smaller families to begin with, but also the pressure on children. So once you have given birth, you basically expected to send the child to all these different schools, all these different after school tutoring, and that is very costly for the parents. They're not saying, and also time consuming as well, of course.
Right.
So the reason why the government wants to reduce pressure on children is also to encourage people to then have more children.
All right. And I know a lot of that narrative is around, a populous country being a strong country. And there's a lot of concern, at least that I've seen raised in Chinese media, around young people maybe not being physically strong enough to serve. They need more young people to serve in the military, and they need strong young people to serve in the military. And so there's been a government reaction against, of all things, Korean boy bands. So can you put that in context? Is this all part of the same party narrative?
Yeah, it is about enforcing strict gender roles and about what they call cultivating masculinity among young men. So the concerns are that young men today, they want to look like their idols, people that look like Korean boy band, who look very pretty, I guess, skinny, perhaps not overly muscly. And they are concerned that those idols are making the young men wanting to be like them, and instead of wanting to be what they think it should be more masculine looking men.
So while the Western media is concerned about rising nationalism among Chinese youth, it sounds like the Chinese Communist Party is more concerned with is the right word for it, the feminization of Chinese youth?
Yeah, they did use feminization of men as one of the things they are concerned about. They have publicly said that, yes.
And what about women then? If I think back to the Communist Party tropes of 30 or 50 years ago, it was women's liberation. Women should be in uniform in the army alongside men, working in the work brigades alongside men. Is that? I mean, has the party now flipped that?
Not quite. So, I mean, the official line is still that women, holds up half the sky.
Right. And is that Mao who? Is that a Mao quote?
Sorry?
Is that a Mao quote? Women hold up half the sky.
Yes, that's a Mao quote, yes. And they're still pushing officially for equality between men and women. Okay. But in real life, women are experiencing many barriers especially in their career, because a lot of companies wouldn't hire women of childbearing age, especially if they haven't had children, because they expect women to then get pregnant. Right. So there's a lot of discrimination against women in the workplace still.
The irony is that we know pretty well from a couple of decades, at least, of social science on this, that one of the keys to economic development is, of course, women in the workplace, and not just in the workplace, but women having equal access to the workplace so that you make full use of the human resources of society. So that if China wanted to be the most economically powerful country it could be, it's not keeping women at home to bear children that should be their goal. It should be women in the workforce who then have proper support to be able to bear children, but continue progressing in the workforce. Do Chinese leaders not understand that? I mean, we have lots of good social science on this. Is no one telling them?
They do. The women's workforce participation rate in China is still very high compared to other countries. Okay. So they are in the workforce, but the problem is, the quality of the job they get compared to the men, and the fact that in China it is still very much expected socially, especially in certain areas, for women to do all the housework as well.
All right. Now, Yun Jiang, thanks for joining us today. I want to ask you one final question. I know we have to go, but a final question I can't resist. What is going to happen with the reappointment of Xi Jinping as president of the People's Republic of China?
Oh, I think it's quite certain he will get another term.
And will there be controversy over that, or will it just sail through with no problem?
There was controversies when they removed the term limit, but since then, I think it appears smooth sailing. I'm sure in the background, there has been a lot of resistance, but seems to have all been overcome.
And young people will accept that, or young people will have no choice?
Well, I don't think they have a choice. And besides, I think, elite politics is still a bit far removed from most people.
All right. Yun Jiang, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in a little over 2 weeks at Concilium.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Thanks also to our producer, Nico Mallion. Thanks to our executive producer, Max Hawk-Weaver. The director of the Center for Independent Studies is Tom Switzer. I'm Salvatore Babones. Thank you for watching On Liberty.